What could be worse than being captured and taken prisoner during the Civil War? Well, imagine being held captive in one of the most horrific and brutal prisoner of war camps in American history. In this video, we'll explore the appalling conditions and torture inflicted upon the Union soldiers during their captivity in Camp Sumter, and how they struggled to survive in this brutal environment. Get ready to learn about one of the darkest moments in American history, and how these soldiers were subjected to unimaginable suffering and torture that you won't believe. The American Civil War was marked by intense and brutal fighting that resulted in the deaths of many soldiers and civilians. It was the deadliest conflict fought on American soil, with estimates ranging from 625,000 to 750,000 soldiers dead. Amidst this conflict, the Confederacy established several prisoner of war camps, one of which was Camp Sumter, also known as Andersonville Prison. This camp was a place of horror, where thousands of Union prisoners were held, and nearly 13,000 of them died from diseases and inadequate food and water supplies. Camp Sumter was opened on February 1864 and initially covered 16 acres, enclosed by a 15-foot-high wooden fence. However, as the number of prisoners grew, so did the size of the camp. The overcrowded conditions were deplorable, with each prisoner having a space of only around 5 feet by 6 feet. As the camp expanded, even more prisoners were sent there, exacerbating the already dire conditions. The Confederacy struggled to obtain sufficient food for themselves and the prisoners, resulting in poor diets that caused health problems, such as scurvy, dysentery, and typhoid fever. The mortality rate was high, and many inmates suffered from various health issues. Camp Sumter was described as hell, and its story is a testament to the brutal torture inflicted on prisoners of war during the American Civil War. Poor sanitation led to filthy living conditions, with the creek as the sole source of drinking water that also served as the camp's communal toilet, filled with human waste from thousands of sick people. Prisoners were given no new clothes and often had to make do with rags, which were taken from the deceased. As one prisoner recounted, before one was fairly cold, his clothes would be appropriated and divided, and I've seen many sharp fights between contesting claimants. The camp was surrounded by forests, but there was a severe lack of wood for inmates to use for warmth or cooking. Additionally, the prisoners suffered from undercooked food rations due to the lack of utensils. Within 7 months of the camp's opening, many of the inmates were emaciated, covered in filth and vermin, and barely recognizable as human beings. One former inmate described the sight as a spectacle that froze our blood with horror and made our hearts fail within us. In the midst of their intense emotions, many of our men exclaimed with a sense of urgency, "Could this be hell? May God protect us." It was only He who could save their souls from such a dreadful place. In the center of the enclosure was a swamp, covering about 3 or 4 acres of the confined area. Some parts of this marshy place had been used as a toilet by the prisoners, and the ground was covered with excrement. The stench rising from the center was suffocating. Our 90 were allocated a ground near the edge of this fenced area, and we dreaded the thought of surviving the hot summer weather in such a terrifying environment. As a former president once said, on arriving here, the new prisoners would exclaim, "Is this hell?" Yes, they would soon become numb and enter the midst of the awful decay. The Confederate authorities never removed any waste, and there were hardly any visits by the supervising officers. The prisoners' clothing was in extremely poor condition. Very few had any shoes, and only latecomers had coats and pants. More than half were indecently exposed, and many were completely naked. The proportion of deaths resulting from starvation included those caused by diseases such as diarrhea, dysentery, and scurvy due to limited food cannot be determined. However, to the best of my knowledge, information, and belief, there were scores of deaths every month. We could point out many prisoners who were mere skeletons, and for whom such a fate was inevitable. A portion of the camp was referred to as the deadline, a small fenced area that served as a no man's land that separated prisoners from the wall. The fence was constructed from roughly cut logs, and stakes were driven into the ground to prevent inmates from approaching it. Guards and sentries patrolled the area, and many prisoners found touching or crossing the deadline was a shot on sight. Some prisoners likely entered this area to end their suffering. During this time, prisoner of war camps were a new concept, and there were few laws pertaining to their treatment. Surviving in Camp Sumter relied heavily on one's social network and their ability to rely on others for assistance. Networks existed within the camp, and prisoners would barter food and clothing, as well as provide protection against other inmates. It was found that having a strong social network increased an inmate's chance of survival and provided a sense of companionship. However, not all prisoners were seeking companionship. The Anderson Raiders were a group of inmates who robbed other prisoners of their food, clothing, and money, using clubs as weapons and killing to get their way. Another group was established to prevent these attacks and caught most of the raiders, subjecting them to severe punishment, including beatings, being thrown into stocks, and even hanging. It was shameful that prisoners were stealing from and leaving others to die. In July 1864, Captain Henry Wirz, the commandant, freed 5 Union prisoners to deliver a petition signed by the camp's prisoners to reinstate prisoner exchanges, allowing for the release of some inmates due to overcrowding. Approximately 13,000 of the approximately 45,000 prisoners who were sent to Andersonville during the American Civil War perished there. The majority of these deaths occurred as a direct result of the Confederate government's treatment of the Union prisoners and the lack of care that was provided for them. The widespread lack of food across the Confederate states contributed to the deaths of many prisoners who suffered from disease and starvation. In addition to this, the officials and prison guards lacked the proper equipment to effectively manage the location. Some of the inmates at Camp Sumter made an effort to flee, while others organized themselves into groups and dug tunnels in an effort to tunnel their way out of the camp and into the forest that was nearby. However, as the prisoners' health continued to deteriorate and the number of deaths reached approximately 100 per day, escaping the prison became an increasingly difficult task. Some of the prisoners would even pretend to be dead so that they could be transported within the bodies, only to recover and make their escape in the cover of the night. After the commandant became aware of this strategy, he issued an order mandating that everyone be examined by a medical professional before being removed. In May of 1865, when the camp was finally freed, the prisoners were said to resemble human skeletons amid hellish scenes of desolation. The former commandant of Camp Sumter, Henry Wirz, faced charges of war crimes when he was brought to trial. The testimony of some witnesses suggested that he was responsible for acts of cruelty and murder, while the testimony of others suggested that he was absent from the camp for the majority of the time. In spite of his efforts to better the conditions, which included asking for more food, he was ultimately found guilty, sentenced to death, and hanged. During the American Civil War, the Sumter prison served as a Confederate prison of war camp. There, approximately 13,000 people perished as a result of starvation and widespread disease. The conditions both inside and outside of the camp were described as being comparable to that of a true hell on earth, and the guards exhibited little concern for the health and safety of the prisoners. As we conclude this video, it's important to remember the horrors that prisoners of war endured during the American Civil War, particularly at places like Camp Sumter, also known as Andersonville Prison. The conditions were unimaginable, and the suffering was immense. We must honor the sacrifice and bravery of those who served and remember the atrocities they faced. This part of history serves as a reminder of the importance of treating all people with respect and dignity, regardless of the circumstances. We must continue to learn from the past and work towards a better future, where such atrocities never happen again. If you found this video informative, please consider sharing it with others and subscribing to our channel for more thought-provoking content.